or is it to the EFF's credit?
I would say it was an honorable response, and I think the reality here is that he probably put his own personal convictions first before his political convictions, because I think we've seen other political leaders simply say that no, they're not going anywhere until they're convicted of something in a court of law. But I think for him as a human being, he felt that his integrity being undermined in the court of public opinion was not tenable. And of course, him being in charge of the finance ministry, where credibility is key, simply meant that he thought that the best thing would be for him to step aside and give somebody else an opportunity to actually run the ministry.
The honour doesn't negate the fact that there's still issues to deal with, though.
Yeah, of course, the questions will linger on, and the key issues that we also want to know about, as we heard earlier on, is what really happened in the PIC conversations. And I think why that becomes important is that if you really go and unpack the very essence of what state capture is, it's really a question of, do particular individuals, do particular families enjoy a much closer proximity to political decision makers than they ordinarily would have if they were ordinary human beings. And I think for us, if we then start hearing that even his own family sort of had these types of conversations where perhaps his son might have approached the PIC when his father was the chair of the PIC, it really just leaves a very sour taste. And I think that that story has not yet been told in full. He has, of course, said that the Zondo Commission is free to investigate on that particular matter. The EFF obviously is going to ride this out as long as possible because it gives them political mileage. And of course, the issue there for them is that it doesn't matter what the role of the person is, for as long as that person is an ANC deployee, then the EFF saying that they're the ones that got him out, the EFF saying that it is because of their own investigation that that person is being hounded out, undermines the ANC standing in public. So of course we should not be surprised that the EFF is really going to ride and take credit for this.
Yeah. So following the announcement yesterday, social media propped up all the tweets that Mr. Mboweni had written before, saying he just doesn't have an appetite for going back to government. How much persuasion do you think it took to get him to say yes?
Well, remember, we also picked up the song. Remember, there's a song also. I think what happened here is that literally, because we were plunged into a crisis based on last week's testimony, he could not have said no, in spite of the fact that he might feel that perhaps it is time for new blood to be at the Treasury. If you remember that tweet that he put out in February, that was back at a time where President Cyril Ramaphosa was essentially trying to constitute a new cabinet. So that was a more managed transition where obviously people would have had conversations and people would have made recommendations on who perhaps should have been able to step into that particular ministry. The situation is quite different now because it really was a crisis, and the fact that you've got the midterm budget happening in a couple of weeks simply meant that there wasn't sufficient time or latitude for the president to spend time deliberating on this. You saw the pressure that everybody was putting on him, asking, when are you going to make the decision, when are you going to tell us what is going on? So I think it accelerated his decision making.
What are your thoughts on the state capture inquiry?
Look, we've got Barbara Hogan coming up today, and I think what is quite important about Barbara Hogan is that she was part of the first cabinet under President Jacob Zuma, and she was one of the very first ones to leave around 2010. So I think what will probably come out is perhaps she's going to take us into her confidence and explain what she thinks led to her being exiled from cabinet. We know she was part of the critical ministry, which is really at the epicenter.
Because I'm wondering, will she stay within the realm of what she needs to answer today, or will she give additional information?
I think she'll give additional information, and I think she's the type of person for whom obviously she's now in political office, so there is no incentive for her to hold back. If she really feels that this issue is much bigger than what has been ventilated before, she will say so. And I think if you then talk about state-owned enterprises, which was her portfolio until she was moved and replaced by Malusi Gigaba, that conversation will definitely creep into her testimony today, where then she's going to say perhaps that by the time she left, these were the conversations that were being had, and by the time she moved, these are how things changed, and perhaps some of those things were linked to the state capture phenomenon. We'll just have to wait and see.
We've just been watching, both you and I, the opposition parties all saying, now you need to do something about the other ministers who are implicated. What's Malusi Gigaba's political future?
Look, I think the difficulty here is that Nhlanhla Nene essentially issued a public apology. He sort of went on this path towards absolution of his own accord. The problem that President Cyril Ramaphosa will have is that none of the other ministers, in spite of what we've seen, in spite of what we read, none of them have ever been found guilty of any crime, with the exception perhaps of Malusi Gigaba and his his testimony under oath, which was found to be patently untrue by the courts. He is appealing that matter to the Constitutional Court. So perhaps if the Constitutional Court denies him leave to appeal, which I suspect they will do, then it will force the president's hand to say, look, there is a judgment standing against you that says you lied under oath. We've already had one person leaving cabinet on the basis that their public utterances were found to be untrue. So perhaps now it is also your opportunity to say it is in the best interest of the political party for me to move aside. The bigger problem is that if he and perhaps a person like Matabele Dlamini do not get removed, it really just gives political mileage to opposition parties who are now going to use this precedent that has been set by Nhlanhla Nene to say, well, how do you keep the other people in there in spite of the fact that, you've seen the things that they've done, you've seen the public perception around them. And what one really does have to balance here is really what the public view of the ANC is going to be in the run-up to an election, especially if opposition parties are given the space to keep attacking the Ramaphosa cabinet on the basis of people that are in there. Is he then willing to take the gamble and say, look, the public profile and the public standing of the ANC cannot afford to have these people? We have to wait and see.
How should Tito Mboweni use the goodwill the rand is
I think
safe
what he really
the markets are happy?
He's riding on a high right now, and I think a lot of people obviously see him as a person of credibility and a person who really will know what to do. And I think for him, he then needs to take this opportunity to have the painful conversations, because it is now that he comes in and says, look, the state of public finances is as follows. He needs to be as very clear and put his cards on the table and then ask society at large to say, please work with me in fixing that. But it will serve him no good for him to pretend that everything is working well when clearly things have collapsed in terms of our economic growth trajectory.
What will be the ripple effect of those tough conversations? The first person who testified at the inquiry was talking about the processes of dispersing the public purse, and obviously that would have to change in terms of how people have just had carte blanche over what they can do and how they can run the show.
I think the bigger thing that we're probably going to get out of the state capture inquiry is us trying to understand whether there are particular loopholes in the internal controls around state finances. If there are things that people use to perhaps circumvent the existing legislation, we see a lot of evidence of that where people simply do not go out for tenders, for example, simply because the law says that in instances where you can avoid going for a tender, this is how you do it. And perhaps what you want to be able to see is him ushering in a new sense of accountability and a new sense of fiscal discipline, and saying to everybody around the room within these cabinet colleagues who are in a meeting this morning, to say to them, look, fiscal discipline is what we have to champion, because once we can see that materializing, people are then going to start having faith in the government again.
So does Tito Mboweni rewrite the midterm budget statement, or is he just going to cut and paste?
The midterm budget statement is not a politician statement. It's really the bureaucrats that do the crafting. They're the ones that work out the numbers, and it's simply the political principal who delivers it. So it'll be exactly whatever Nhlanhla Nene was working on, this what is going to get delivered. And of course, Nhlanhla Nene would have been working around the whole, with fellow cabinet colleagues anyway, so it's not like there's going to be a new cabinet that then says, no, actually we think that medium-term budget statement should look very different. So for me, it's going to be Nhlanhla Nene, a midterm budget being delivered by Tito Mboweni.
2 days ago, there was confusion around whether Nhlanhla Nene will go to the IMF meetings in Indonesia. Is Tito going to go now? And
it probably doesn't make sense for him to travel now.
Does it make a difference for them?
Because we already have the Director General who has gone in to attend that meeting, and he's obviously the official alternate to the Minister of Finance. So I think where we are right now, we're probably going to see that the rest of this week will be dedicated to a handover process. Obviously, it will be an awkward handover process because the Director General himself is not there. But I think the political principals will be able to sit around the table and say, look, these are the issues that we're working on, and this is how you can take things forward.
Khaya Sithole, thank you so much for your analysis. That's Khaya Sithole, who's a political analyst and economic analyst and
part-time accountant.
Whatever works, he says. All right, we're inviting you as our